people like Neville Goddard and Emmett Fox and other great authors and speakers in the past have talked about prayer and what it actually means and how to go about it. And in their studies, if you read their material, you can find that they are actually describing in a way what fasting is also all about. So for this video, I wanted to discuss what exactly is fasting as it is described in the Bible, because the more I contemplated those words from Jesus, the more it actually started to reveal things to me that helped me overall with my own unfoldment, with goals that I want to improve and manifest in my world. But first of all, if we talk about fasting here, a couple years ago there was like a really kind of morbid experiment. Like, I call it morbid because, well, looking back on it, it wasn't really that much fun to do, and it's still not something I plan on doing anytime soon necessarily. But I once actually thought it would be interesting to fast for like as long as I could. So I went like 16 days living on nothing. And those 16 days were actually really, really intense and kind of terrible looking back on it. I mean, it wasn't, one thing I remember about that period was that for some reason I became completely unable to think negative thoughts. But that was honestly because my body felt a little exhausted and really strange in a way that it just distracted me entirely from my ability to even contemplate negative things. So, it can be useful in that sense, I suppose, but it's not really recommended. I mean, they say there's health benefits to fasting physically, of course, but the fasting that we're going to talk about for this video is not that kind of fasting, is also what I want to make clear right from the start, so that people are not like, oh, I'm not interested in fasting, what the hell. It's okay, you don't have to be fasting physically speaking. That's going to be the message of this video. So what then would fasting be about? First of all, let's consider what prayer is. Now, prayer is to rise up to the thing you desire. So that is why Jesus said, whatsoever things you desire when you pray, believe that you receive them and you shall. But in translations, sometimes it's worded a little differently. That might sometimes come out a little better. Because I've also read it along the lines of, whatever you desire when you pray, believe that you will receive and you will have them, etc. So even though they're saying the same thing, the wording, because it's a little different, sometimes when it's a little different, it actually helps a lot. But here's the thing. Fasting. What role is it playing? Because Jesus said in the book of Mark, when his disciples could not get rid of some unclean spirit, well, these things are done by prayer and fasting. So he suddenly added this word fasting to it, that perhaps, I mean, in that famous quotation of his about whatever you desire when you pray, I suppose it could have been useful for people to hear that word somehow, to have that included in that saying, because it would make a lot more sense on what we're actually doing here. Because if this is taken literally, when he said this is done by prayer and fasting, well then, you could be sitting in a church, for example, or at home, fold your hands and pray to a God in the heavens, while he or she, the person in question, is not eating or drinking anything physically, so that they are fasting. But now let us consider this metaphysically, because to me, fasting means to stop feasting on what the senses are telling you. So by prayer and fasting, you can realize your own objectives. You see, if you've been having issues realizing your objectives, consider, have I also been fasting? Like, metaphysically speaking, have you been doing that as well? And you're probably going to recognize this, that how Neville Goddard and others have talked about this, but they maybe not have used this term at all. But hopefully it adds something to your perception on how to go about all of this. So I would say you have to give it a shot. If you have a goal, you start to pray, which is to believe that you already have it inside your consciousness first and foremost. You do that by seeing and feeling the fulfillment of your desires through the power I actually should say through the proper use of your imagination. Making videos like this, where it's more like a podcast, you get to hear the errors I make sometimes trying to explain myself, but that's part of the deal here. But as you've studied Neville Goddard, you understand this, right? That you use your imagination in order to see and feel the fulfillment of your desire. So this is very powerful in and of its own. That's what Neville generally would be talking about. But now I also wanted to say, be sure to start fasting. Now, Neville in his own way would mention this, but he wouldn't say it's fasting. But I thought it was interesting just for the purpose of us having even more angles to look at all this. So fasting, which means to stop feeding your mind on what the senses are telling you, metaphysically speaking. So you stop giving energy to the things that are not in harmony with your prayer work, with the feeling as if it's already a reality. Because spiritually, it truly is a reality. God has already granted your desires the moment you became aware of their fulfillment within yourself. Now, ultimately, and the biggest goal becomes for any person to totally enjoy the fulfillment of their dreams within their consciousness and have that be enough. So they no longer need it physically too. You see, this needing it physically is ultimately part of what keeps us stuck, and even Neville eventually during his lectures would start saying more and more regularly to his audience that he hoped that people would just want to find God and not really worry anymore about all this money and fame and other stuff that they might want physically speak. And he would say, it's my great hope that you would start to see God instead. But up until that point, if you are not ready yet, you just use this to your own physical goals, is basically what he said. And I would have to agree with him. So use this process for any physical goal of yours. Perhaps you've never studied Neville Goddard, but perhaps you've had. I know some of you done it, others perhaps haven't ever done it. Regardless, take this concept. You start to believe, you start to first see and feel in order to believe through your imagination that your prayer is already granted, and then remain in a fasted state, which is keep your mind from feasting on what your senses are telling you that is completely contradictory to your dream. Now, in the Bible, it also started talking. I think it was in the book of Matthew, but in other ones it actually is also briefly, mentioned here and there. Sometimes it's different, but the point is that they talked about this 40-day fast of Jesus, which can't be taken literally as fasting physically from food. Now, I mean, again, it's up to you if you want to try something like that. Some have, most people don't. I haven't done it myself. I have went for 16 days without food, but it was not really perhaps the right preparation on my part. So going 40 days would take a bit more dedication on my part to pull that off when it is purely physical. But again, if it's a metaphysical description of his, then it actually becomes also pretty revealing. Because whatever time was needed to stop his mind from constantly indulging in sense perceptions and hungering after things of this world, well, that is what this fast was about that they described. Once it finally stopped, he could operate from divine spiritual perception given to him by God himself. And God's divine radiance can only be perceived if it is not blocked by all these physical things we obsess over. His wisdom can only come to us if we make space for him in our minds, by letting go of the lower things of life. It is also hinted at by the fact that Satan came along and tried to tempt him with physical things. So to me it is clearly showcasing the metaphysical meaning of fasting. However, I've seen enough people also ask and wonder how Jesus fasted for 40 days without food and drinks, but that is if you look at it only from a physical perspective. It is more useful to see things spiritually, for then you have something to work with for yourself on your own wonderful journey back towards God, your heavenly home. Now, I hope you'll consider it and start working with this concept of fasting from this angle as described during this video, because to me, again, it has helped a lot, especially if I meditate. The act of having your eyes closed to this world, to actually go inward into yourself and focus on your desire. As Neville ended up saying, he hopes that your desire will be for God. Well, I would have to agree by now myself, because that is one of the main things I've mostly been doing, is just contemplate God in my mind. God, God, always God. And then I have all these visions and dreams regularly where I can't even describe them in words properly. Sometimes I jot them down, other times they're just so heavenly that I'm at a loss for words, which is exactly how many sages have described this as well throughout the ages, that if you really start dealing with the heavenly, then human words start to, fail entirely. They can't really describe the divine, because it's just beyond it. But I can tell you some wonderful things will start to happen if your whole desire is for God mostly, but for many it is not. So you want things like money and success and a relationship, especially a relationship, right? That's what people want. Well, start praying and fasting. So that means you would start to feel as if you've already as if you already are married, for example, or as if you already are in a wonderful relationship. But then through the act of fasting, what happens? You stop looking at the fact that you are alone. So you are no longer letting your mind be influenced and dominated by this perception, but I'm alone, I'm all alone, there's nobody here, there's no partner, there's nobody wants me. All these things, they have to be let go to the act of fasting itself on top of your prayer work. And then once you do that, you can clearly see your whole mind would be filled with the feeling of your wish fulfilled. And as that remains, that is when God can make his, magic happen. He can then make your prayer work turn into a reality, unless he has something better for you in store. You see, he knows obviously that most people don't want to be alone and lonely, etc. So he probably will grant you a relationship, of course, but sometimes we are a little obsessed with it has to be this person or that, and then perhaps God has a better idea and he brings you someone that is even greater than what you thought you wanted, etc. But this all occurs when you remain in this prayer and fasted state. So don't take it literally physically. You don't have to refrain from eating or drinking. Of course, I would say, like anybody else, don't overindulge in it either, but fasting in this case is purely mental and metaphysical. And when you get it, it should actually be pretty exciting, because it gives you something to work on for yourself. It puts the power in your hands, because that is part of being this child of God. You have this power. God, he has given you this power, but you are to use this for yourself and develop it for yourself through understanding and practice. So it makes more sense if you become better at it. So hopefully this gave you something to work with, and if you have questions about it, you can always email me or, get an oracle card reading even for if you want for some goals. But other than that, I hope it gave you something to think about and that will help you on your journey. Now, if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing to receive inspirational videos on a regular basis. With that being said, dear viewer, never forget that we are the dreamers.